The Long Walk to Freedom, the Nelson Mandela story. The air hangs heavy over the small village of Kunu, thick with the scent of earth and possibility. In this pocket of the Eastern Cape, where the rolling hills meet vast stretches of grassland and the wind carries stories older than memory, the world moves at a different pace. Here, in 1918, colonial rule pressed down on the land like a weight, yet in the kraals and beneath the thatch roofs, something ancient persisted. Something unbreakable. On a day in July when winter gripped the southern hemisphere, a child drew his first breath in nearby Mvezo, a breath that would one day echo across continents and shake the foundations of an empire built on hate. His father, Gadla Henry Mpakanyiswa, a counselor to the Tembu king, looked down at his son with pride and named him Rolihlahla, a name that in the Xhosa tongue meant pulling the branch of a tree, colloquially understood as troublemaker. The old man could not have known how prophetic that name would prove. Circles, and before young Rolihlahla could walk steady on his legs, his father's world crumbled. A dispute with a white colonial magistrate, a refusal to bow, a stripping away of title and land and cattle, everything that made a man whole in Tembu society. The family moved to Kunu, a smaller village, where they lived in huts with earthen floors and ate what the land provided, maize and sorghum, pumpkin and beans. Here, in this place of scarcity and beauty, the boy learned his first lessons about power and its absence, about dignity maintained in the face of dispossession. His father's proud bearing never wavered, even as his means diminished. This stubborn sense of fairness, this refusal to accept humiliation, passed into the boy's blood like an inheritance more valuable than gold. Rolihlahla's childhood existed in a space between two ages. He herded cattle across the hills, felt the sun on his back and the grass beneath his bare feet. Listened to the stories the old men told around the fire. They spoke of the wars their grandfathers fought, of how the Amaxhosa and Abatembu people had resisted the white invaders for generations, of battles won and lost, of land stolen piece by piece. These were not distant histories, but living memories, wounds that had not yet scarred over. The boy absorbed these stories the way the earth absorbs rain, and they took root deep inside him, where no one could see. When darkness came, his mother would light a small fire, and by its glow she would tell him different stories. Stories from the Methodist mission, where she had learned about a God of love and justice. Two worlds, African and European, mingled in the boy's consciousness, neither quite reconciling with the other. 9 years old, his father fell ill. The undiagnosed ailment that Mandela would later believe was lung disease consumed Gadla Henry slowly. The boy watched his father grow weaker, watched the proud man reduced to coughing and pain, watched death arrive as it always does, without ceremony or mercy. After the funeral rites, his mother made a decision that would alter the course of her son's life. She took him to the great place at Mkekezweni, the royal residence of the acting regent of the Thembu people, Jongintaba Dalindyebo. Years before, Gadla Henry had recommended Jongintaba for the position of regent, and now Jongintaba would honor that debt by raising Gadla's son as his own. The boy traveled by motorcar, his first time in such a vehicle, away from the only home he had known, certain he would never see beloved Kunu again. Mkekezweni, everything changed. Where Kunu had been small and humble, the great place hummed with activity and importance. Chiefs came and went on official business. The regent's household included his son Justice and daughter Nomafu, and young Rolihlahla was given the same status as these royal children. He attended a one-room school next to the palace, learning English and Xhosa, history and geography. But his real education came from watching the regent work, observing how he listened to people, how he resolved disputes, how he made decisions only after everyone had spoken. Democracy in practice, though no one called it that. The chiefs who came to the great place would sit in council, and each man would have his say, from the most powerful to the least, and only then would the regent speak, summarizing what had been said and guiding them toward consensus. This was the Tembu way. This was leadership, not as dominance, but as service. The boys studied this form of governance the way a craftsman studies his master's hands. When Rolihlahla turned 16, the time came for him to undergo ulwaluko, the traditional Xhosa circumcision ceremony that marked the passage from boyhood to manhood. 25 other boys would be initiated with him. This was not merely a surgical procedure, but a sacred ritual, connecting them to countless generations of ancestors who had walked this same path. For weeks they prepared, learning the songs and customs, steeling themselves for the ordeal. The ceremony itself involved pain, as all true transitions do, but it also involved transformation. When it was complete, when the boys had proven they could endure what needed to be endured, a great celebration erupted. Cattle were slaughtered, beer flowed, speeches rang out under the African sky. Chief Melikwili, the main speaker, rose to address the newly made men, and his words cut through the joy like a cold wind. The chief's face held sorrow as he looked at the young men before him. "There sit our sons," he said, "young, healthy, and handsome, the flower of the Xhosa tribe, the pride of our nation. We have just circumcised them in a ritual that promises them manhood. But I am here to tell you that it is an empty, illusory promise, a promise that can never be fulfilled. For we, Xhosas, and all black South Africans, are a conquered people. We are slaves in our own country. We are tenants on our own soil. We have no strength, no power, no control over our own destiny in the land of our birth." The words fell heavy as stones. The young men sat in shocked silence. Among these young men are chiefs who will never rule because we have no power to govern ourselves. Among these young men are soldiers who will never fight, for we have no weapons to fight with. The abilities, the intelligence, the promise of these young men will be squandered in their attempt to eke out a living doing the simple chores for the white man. The chief continued his lament, and something inside young Rolihlahla shifted. The words did not make complete sense to him then, standing there in his ceremonial garb, fresh from a ritual as old as the hills themselves. But they lodged in his mind like seeds in fertile soil, and in time they would grow into something the chief himself might not have anticipated. Not resignation, but resolve. Not acceptance, but resistance. The world that the chief described, a world where black men existed only to serve white masters, where potential withered and dreams died before they could take root. This was a world that did not have to be. And if it did not have to be, then it could be changed. The boy did not yet know how. He did not yet understand the scope of what would be required. But standing there, newly made a man by his people's ancient customs, he made a silent promise that would shape the rest of his days. The Awakening. The path from traditional life to modern education wound through two Methodist institutions that would shape the young man's mind and character. At Clarkbury Boarding Institute, Rolihlahla excelled through what he would later describe as plain, hard work. The school exposed him to a wider world, to ideas and possibilities beyond the confines of Tembu tradition. His teacher, a woman named Miss Mdingane, followed the custom of giving African students European names, and on his first day of school, she christened him Nelson. No one recorded why she chose this particular name, but it stuck, and over time it would eclipse the name his father gave him. From Clarkbury, he progressed to Healdtown, a larger Wesleyan secondary school with over 1,000 students. Here, he encountered Reverend Arthur Wellington, who would proclaim with great solemnity that he was a descendant of the Duke of Wellington, a claim that years later would make Mandela laugh when he recounted it. Here also, he found his stride as an athlete, excelling in boxing and long-distance running, sports that taught him about endurance and strategy, about when to attack and when to conserve strength. In 1939, at age 21, Nelson Mandela enrolled at the University College of Fort Hare, the only residential institution of higher learning for black students in all of South Africa. Fort Hare drew the brightest minds from across sub-Saharan Africa, and to be admitted was to join an elite group, the future leaders and intellectuals of the continent. The university sat in the Cape Province like a beacon, a place where young black men and women could study law and medicine, literature and mathematics, where they could imagine futures that the larger society insisted were impossible. Mandela threw himself into his studies with characteristic determination, though he would later admit he was no natural genius, just a man willing to work harder than most. He studied English and anthropology, politics and Roman Dutch law. He joined the Drama Society, participated in debates, represented his dormitory in student government. He made friends who would remain allies for life, among them Oliver Tambo, a brilliant young man from Pondoland who shared his interest in law and justice. But Mandela's time at Fort Hare would end abruptly, not because of academic failure, but because of principle. In his second year, he was elected to the Student Representative Council. For some time, students had been dissatisfied with the quality of food and the powerlessness of the SRC, which existed more as decoration than as genuine representation. When elections were held, a majority of students voted to boycott the SRC unless the administration addressed their grievances. Mandela, aligning himself with the student majority, resigned from his position rather than serve on a body the students had rejected. Dr. Kerr, the university's principal, saw this as insubordination and expelled Mandela for the remainder of the year, giving him an ultimatum he could return only if he agreed to serve on the SRC. Mandela refused. This early act of defiance, this willingness to sacrifice personal advancement for principle, revealed something essential about the man he was becoming. He would not bend to unjust authority, even when bending would have been the easier path. Returning to Mkhikezweni, Mandela found the regent furious at his expulsion. But Jongintaba had larger plans that involved arranged marriages for both Mandela and Justice to consolidate tribal alliances and secure the royal succession. When Mandela learned of his guardian's intentions, he faced a choice between obedience to the man who had raised him and freedom to choose his own destiny. He chose freedom. Together with Justice, he hatched an escape plan, taking some of the regent's cattle to sell for train fare and fleeing to Johannesburg. It was 1941. Mandela was 23 years old. The great city beckoned, dangerous and promising in equal measure, a place where a young man could reinvent himself or be swallowed whole. Johannesburg in the early 1940s pulsed with energy and tension. Gold mines drove the economy, and thousands of black laborers worked deep underground in conditions that would break many men. The city sprawled in unofficial patterns, with townships for black residents springing up wherever the land was cheapest and least desirable. Alexandra, Sophiatown, Orlando, these names would become synonymous with resistance and resilience, places where jazz played in shebeens and political consciousness grew in the shadows. Mandela first found work as a mine security officer, then as a law clerk at a firm run by a white man named Lazar Sidelski, who treated his black employees with unusual respect. Through connections at the firm, Mandela met Walter Sisulu, a man several years his senior who ran a real estate business and was deeply involved in the African National Congress. Sisulu saw something in the tall young man from the Transkei, a combination of dignity and hunger, intelligence and determination. Walter Sisulu became more than a friend. He became a mentor, introducing Mandela to a network of activists and intellectuals who gathered to discuss the future of black South Africa. These were not men who accepted the status quo. They read and debated, argued and organized, trying to understand how a minority white government maintained control over millions of black people, and, more importantly, how that control might be broken. At Sisulu's house, Mandela met Evelyn Mace, a trainee nurse from the Transkei. She was quiet and kind, devoted to her Jehovah's Witness faith. They married in October 1944, and for a time, Mandela tried to balance the demands of family life with his growing political involvement. Their first child, Madiba Thembekile, called Tembi, was born in February 1945. A daughter, Makaziwe, followed in 1947, but died of meningitis after only 9 months. The loss devastated both parents, but Mandela had little time to grieve. The world was calling him, urgent and insistent. Through Sisulu's, Mandela resumed his bachelor's degree through correspondence from the University of South Africa, then enrolling at the University of Witwatersrand to study for a law degree. At Wits, he encountered something he had never experienced before, a genuinely multiracial environment where black students studied alongside whites, Indians, and coloreds. Here, he met communists and liberals, radicals and reformers, people who believed that South Africa's racial order was not natural or inevitable, but constructed, and therefore capable of being dismantled. Joe Slovo, a white communist lawyer, Bram Fisher, an Afrikaner advocate who would later defend Mandela in court and paid dearly for his principles. Ismail Mir, an Indian intellectual. Ruth First, a journalist and activist. These friendships challenged Mandela's earlier nationalist views, which had held that Africans alone should lead the liberation struggle. Slowly, he came to embrace a broader vision, one that included all races working together against oppression. Within the African National Congress, that Mandela would find his true calling. Founded in 1912, the ANC had spent most of its existence as a moderate organization, sending deputations and petitions to the government, hoping to appeal to the better angels of white South African nature. By the time Mandela joined in 1944, a younger generation was growing impatient with these tactics. How many petitions could you send to people who refused to listen? How long could you wait for justice that never came? Mandela, along with Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, and Anton Lembede, formed the ANC Youth League, determined to push the organization toward more militant action. Lembede, a fiery intellectual, articulated a philosophy of African nationalism that insisted black people must lead their own liberation, must stand proud in their African identity rather than seeking acceptance from whites. His ideas electrified the young activists, giving them a framework for understanding their struggle not as begging for rights, but as reclaiming what had been stolen. In 1948, the world shifted beneath their feet. The National Party, running on an explicit platform of apartheid, won the general election. Where previous governments had practiced racial discrimination informally, the National Party would codify it into law, creating a comprehensive system of racial separation and white supremacy that touched every aspect of life. The Population Registration Act classified everyone by race. The Group Areas Act designated where people of different races could live. The Bantu Education Act created an inferior education system designed to prepare black children for lives of servitude. Interracial marriage became illegal. Public facilities were segregated. Black people needed passes to enter white areas. The entire machinery of the state was mobilized to enforce this vision of racial hierarchy. And the ANC, under its new generation of leaders, decided that moderation had failed. It was time for mass action, for resistance that could not be ignored. The Defiance. The morning of June 33, living the 63, for moment, the most beautiful window changes for. The morning of June 33, for moment, the 1333, for moment, the most beautiful window changes. Many won the cheap. The first, the bland themselves, the June 17. The June 17 8, the thirst 43, for moment, the most beautiful window. The previous later of cheaping letter. The Defiance. The morning of June 33, for moment, the 1333, for moment, the multiple window changes. The morning of June 33, The defiance of June 34 and Laddersit, the breaking part of the air. The June 74, the 3030 Thor with Laddersit, the breaking part of the air. The morning of June 33, molt for moment, the 3034, molt for moment, the multiple window changes. Create the first, the difference. The driving more Christian settlement is break in 2,000 feet. The morning of June 33, molt for moment, the 3033, molt for moment, the multiple window changes. The program formula, the first, the method is when you stand from 50 million great institute. It's instructed by a Kurt, which is nothing that it's film the differencer. They accord another discipline so the next to the book is not by human from the same, which will stare that the H-but of G's. The defiance. The performance is over the player. The defiance, the first third. The tridience is two, the truth the difference of a truth. The defiance of truth was treat that is well as any more. When the lengths the method is made ye proved with first one. The defiance, the truth the difference, which any thirst one, the truth the first one, truth. The end of the bogging was check for the difference of studentses. The instance with the national name bade a fitted people interest in minute, which was the defensing teaching avalence the maker. This said mean that the morning of June 34, the bland themselves, the June 17-4. Basically, Jeans becomes the creative instance on support of the Klaus. The Klaus the brick is one. The word the truth, the last precious is actually. The Klaus the press is one, the prostack the eight. God. The Klaus the press is one. The drops 11 thing. The break is hoto, which is one that forgotta the back the one of the day. Implement of a least said, the brick is displayed. The great main shift the break the play, the great his understand the play state by services. The Klaus the break was changed to the truth of cross South Africa. In cities and towns from Cape Town to Johannesburg, from Port Elizabeth to Durban, volunteers gathered with a mixture of trepidation and determination. They knew what awaited them. They had prepared for this moment through weeks of training in non-violent resistance, learning from the examples of Gandhi's campaigns in India. The Defiance Campaign against unjust laws, jointly organized by the African National Congress and the South African Indian Congress, would challenge apartheid through deliberate civil disobedience. Volunteers would break racist laws openly, courting arrest, filling the jails, demonstrating that the system could not function if enough people refused to cooperate. Nelson Mandela, at 33 years old, had been appointed volunteer-in-chief. The weight of this responsibility sat heavy on his shoulders. The first acts of defiance unfolded with practiced precision. In Johannesburg, Nelson Mandela joined Yusuf Dadoo, Moses Kotane, Walter Sisulu, and others in entering a whites-only area without the required permits. In Port Elizabeth, 30 protesters walked into railway waiting rooms reserved for whites. In Boksburg, 53 African and Indian demonstrators refused to obtain permits to enter an African location. In Worcester, volunteers entered the white-only line at the post office. At each location, police waited, almost as if they had been expecting this, which of course they had. The arrests came swiftly but without violence, at least at first. The volunteers went peacefully, raising their thumbs in the new sign of unity, crying out, "Africa!" and "Maibuye!" Let it return. Onlookers cheered and sang freedom songs, and for a brief, shining moment, it felt like the dawn of something new. Stabilized, the campaign caught fire across the country. Week after week, volunteers stepped forward, challenging laws that reduced them to second-class citizens in their own land. They entered segregated facilities, burned their hated passbooks, stayed out past the curfew that treated grown men and women like children who needed to be locked up at night. The government watched with growing alarm. This was not the polite petition-making they were accustomed to from the ANC. This was organized mass resistance, and it was spreading. By October 1952, over 2,000 people had been arrested in a single month. The jails were filling faster than the government could process the inmates. International attention began to focus on South Africa, and for the first time, the United Nations took official notice of apartheid, calling it a threat to peace. The government had to respond, and it responded with characteristic brutality. In August, police arrested 20 national leaders, including Mandela, charging them under the Suppression of Communism Act. The trial provided exactly what the campaigners wanted, a national stage to voice their message. Mandela and his co-accused did not deny their involvement. They stood proudly and explained why they had been forced to break unjust laws, how apartheid itself was the real crime, how they represented millions of people who had no other way to make their voices heard. The magistrate listened, and on December 2nd, 1952, found all 20 guilty of statutory communism, a term so broadly defined that it essentially meant any opposition to apartheid. The sentence came down 9 months hard labor, suspended for 2 years, a warning shot. But the government was not finished. In November, it passed the Criminal Law Amendment Act and the Public Safety Act, new laws specifically designed to crush the defiance campaign by making protest itself punishable with severe penalties and allowing the declaration of states of emergency at will. The finally faced another blow when riots erupted in Port Elizabeth and East London, violence that the organizers had not planned and did not want. Whether the violence was spontaneous or instigated by government agents remains disputed, but it gave the authorities the excuse they needed to crack down hard. Police descended on townships with clubs and guns. Leaders were arrested in sweeps that netted hundreds. Banning orders multiplied, restricting activists to their homes and forbidding them from attending any gatherings. Nelson Mandela received a banning order that confined him to Johannesburg and prohibited him from attending any meetings with more than one person at a time. His role as volunteer-in-chief became impossible to perform. In April 1953, Chief Albert Luthuli, who had been elected President-General of the ANC during the campaign, called it off. The immediate goals had not been achieved. The unjust laws remained on the books, but something more important had happened. The Defiance campaign transformed the ANC from an elite organization into a mass movement. Membership exploded from 7,000 to over 100,000. People across South Africa, people who had never been politically active before, had seen their neighbors and friends stand up to the government and survive. Fear, that powerful weapon of oppression, had been challenged. The campaign also led to the formation of the Colored People's Congress and the Congress of Democrats, organizations that brought people of mixed race and progressive whites into the liberation struggle. These groups would form the Congress Alliance, a multiracial coalition that would shape South African resistance for the next decade. International solidarity movements emerged, with the Defense and Aid Fund in London and the American Committee on Africa in New York raising money and awareness. The world was beginning to pay attention. For Mandela personally, the campaign marked his emergence as a national figure. His leadership had been tested and proven. The government recognized him as a threat, which was why they hit him with banning orders. But banning could not silence him entirely. In September 1953, Mandela wrote a speech titled, "No Easy Walk to Freedom," borrowing the phrase from Indian independence leader Jawaharlal Nehru. The speech was read aloud at a Transvaal ANC meeting by Andrew Kunene, since Mandela was prohibited from attending. In it, he analyzed the new situation created by the government's repressive laws and called for new tactics. "The road to freedom is via the cross," he wrote. "We must realize that the masses had to be made ready for new forms of political struggle. Long speeches, the shaking of fists, the banging of tables, and strongly worded resolutions out of touch with the actual conditions do not bring about mass action and can do a great deal of harm to the organization and the struggle we serve. His words proved prophetic. The government's repression did not end the struggle, it merely changed its form. In 1955, the Congress Alliance organized a Congress of the People at Cliptown, a gathering of nearly 3,000 delegates representing all racial groups. Over 2 days, they debated and adopted the Freedom Charter, a document that would become the cornerstone of the liberation movement's vision. We, the people of South Africa, declare for all our country and the world to know that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, and that no government can justly claim authority unless it is based on the will of all the people. The Charter called for equal rights, land redistribution, nationalization of key industries, free education, and an end to all forms of racial discrimination. It was radical in its demands, but democratic in its vision, a blueprint for a South Africa that did not yet exist, but that millions could now imagine. Government's answer came in December 1956. Before dawn on December 5th, police fanned out across the country, arresting 156 people and charging them with high treason. The treason trial would drag on for 5 years, tying up the leadership of the liberation movement in endless court proceedings. But the government made a tactical error. By grouping all these activists together, it created a sort of extended political seminar, allowing them to meet regularly, discuss strategy, and maintain unity. The trial also provided yet another platform to explain and justify their cause. Lawyers like Bram Fisher and Vernon Beranger tore apart the prosecution's case, exposing its lack of evidence and its reliance on guilt by association. The defendants turned the courtroom into a school on freedom, and the world watched. Eventually, in March 1961, Justice Rumpf would acquit all the remaining accused, ruling that the state had failed to prove that the ANC sought to overthrow the government by violence. But by then, the world had changed again, violently and irrevocably. The breaking point. The morning of March 21st, 1960, began like any other in the township of Sharpeville, south of Johannesburg. But what happened that day would shatter whatever remained of the illusion that apartheid could be challenged through peaceful means alone. The Pan-Africanist Congress, a group that had split from the ANC over disagreements about multiracial cooperation, had called for mass protests against the pass laws. Thousands of black South Africans surrounded the Sharpeville police station, offering themselves for arrest by refusing to carry their passes. The mood was tense, but not violent. Some protesters were singing, children played at the edges of the crowd, and then, without warning, without an order that anyone heard, the police opened fire. Not over the heads of the crowd, not into the air, directly into human beings. 69 people fell dead. Many were shot in the back as they fled. Over 180 were wounded. The massacre lasted less than a minute, but it ended an era. News of Sharpeville ricocheted around the world. Photographs of bodies sprawled in the dirt, of mothers clutching dead children, of the casual brutality of the police response appeared in newspapers from London to New York to Lagos. The United Nations Security Council met in emergency session. Governments condemned South Africa. International outrage built like a wave. Inside the country, fury and grief mixed with fear. The government declared a state of emergency. On April 8th, it banned the African National Congress and the Pan-Africanist Congress, making membership in either organization a criminal offense. Police arrested thousands. ANC leaders went underground or fled into exile. The era of legal opposition was over. And Nelson Mandela, facing the ruins of everything they had built through peaceful resistance, came to a conclusion that would define the next phase of the struggle. In non-violent resistance, he had studied Gandhi, had embraced the principles of the Defiance Campaign, had argued passionately that moral force was more powerful than violence. But after Sharpeville, After watching the government respond to peaceful protest with bullets, after seeing the best of their people gunned down in the street, he could no longer maintain that position. The government had made violence inevitable by refusing every peaceful avenue of change, by answering petition with prison and protest with massacre. If black South Africans did not begin to prepare for armed struggle, they would be slaughtered in their thousands. The debate within the ANC was fierce. Chief Luthuli, who had won the Nobel Peace Prize for his advocacy of non-violence, opposed any move toward violence. Others worried that armed resistance would give the government the excuse it wanted to crush the movement entirely. But Mandela and a core group of activists, including Walter Sisulu, Joe Slovo, and Govan Mbeki, persisted in their arguments. Finally, a compromise was reached. The ANC itself would remain committed to non-violent resistance, but a new organization would be formed, separate but closely allied, that would pursue armed struggle. On December 16, 1961, chosen deliberately to coincide with the Afrikaner commemoration of the Day of the Vow, Umkhonto we Sizwe, Spear of the Nation, announced its existence with a series of coordinated bomb attacks on government installations. The manifesto left at the sites explained the decision in words that Mandela had largely drafted. The time comes in the life of any nation when there remain only two choices: submit or fight. That time has now come to South Africa. We shall not submit, and we have no choice but to hit back by all means in our power in defense of our people, our future, and our freedom. The attacks targeted symbols of apartheid power: electrical installations, pass offices, government buildings. Crucially, they were designed to avoid casualties. This was sabotage, not terrorism. The goal was to demonstrate that the government was not invulnerable, to inspire hope, and to make the cost of maintaining apartheid prohibitively high. Mandela became the first commander of Umkhonto we Sizwe, though he had no military training. That would have to change. In January 1962, he left South Africa illegally, traveling under assumed names and disguises to attend the Pan-African Freedom Movement conference in Addis Ababa. From there, he went on to Algeria, where he watched soldiers training in the desert, learning about guerrilla warfare from those who had fought the French. He visited Morocco, Mali, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Egypt, Tunisia, and Ethiopia, meeting with presidents and freedom fighters, soliciting support for the struggle back home. In London, he met with leaders of the anti-apartheid movement and held a press conference explaining why armed resistance had become necessary. In all these places, people knew South Africa's story, knew about apartheid, knew about Sharpeville. Mandela found support everywhere he went. Arms, money, promises of military training for MK recruits, hope that they were not alone. Was desperate to return home. His marriage to Evelyn had ended in divorce years earlier, strained beyond repair by his constant absences and total dedication to the struggle. In 1958, he had married Winnie Madikizela, a young social worker from Pondoland. She was beautiful and fierce, with her own commitment to the cause, and he loved her desperately, even as he knew that his work would keep them apart more than together. On July 24, 1962, Mandela slipped back into South Africa. He met with ANC leaders in Durban to brief them on his travels. Afterward, driving back toward Johannesburg with Cecil Williams, an activist from Durban, their car was stopped at a police roadblock near Howick. Somehow the police knew who he was. Mandela was taken into custody, ending 17 months as the Black Pimpernel, as the press had dubbed him. He had eluded capture for so long, moving in disguises, never sleeping in the same place twice. But now it was over. The trial for leaving the country illegally and inciting workers to strike took place in November 1962. Mandela defended himself, turning the courtroom into a platform to indict apartheid. He appeared in traditional Tembu kaross, asserting his African identity in a system that sought to erase it. I would say that the whole life of any thinking African in this country drives him continuously to a conflict between his conscience and the law. The law as it is applied, the law as it has been developed over hundreds of years, is a law which in our view is immoral, unjust, and intolerable. Our consciences dictate that we must protest against it, that we must oppose it, and that we must attempt to alter it. The magistrate was unmoved. On November 7, 1962, Mandela was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. He was taken to Pretoria Central Prison, then in May 1963, transferred briefly to Robben Island before being returned to Pretoria. He thought this was his sentence. He did not yet know that the worst was still to come.
The trial that changed the world.
On the afternoon of July 11, 1963, police vans drove down the dusty driveway of Liliesleaf Farm in the Johannesburg suburb of Rivonia. The farm, owned by Arthur Goldreich, had been serving as the secret headquarters of Umkhonto we Sizwe. Inside the main house, the High Command was meeting to discuss Operation Mayibuye, a plan for escalating the armed struggle through guerrilla warfare. They never heard the vehicles approach. The raid was swift and total. Walter Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, Raymond Mflaba, Ahmed Kathrada, Dennis Goldberg, Bob Heppel and others were arrested on the spot. Police found documents, maps and plans that would become the core of the prosecution's case. Among the evidence was material linking Nelson Mandela, already imprisoned, to the founding and leadership of MK. The state had everything it needed to build a case for sabotage and treason, charges that carried the death penalty. The Rivonia trial began on October 9, 1963, at the Palace of Justice in Pretoria. 10 men sat in the dock, accused not just of sabotage, but of conspiracy to overthrow the government through revolution. The courtroom filled with police and spectators. Outside, protesters gathered, their presence kept small by police intimidation, but their spirit unbroken. The world's press descended on Pretoria. The UN General Assembly called for the release of the prisoners. International lawyers offered assistance. The accused knew they faced death. The prosecution made that clear in its opening statements. Deputy Attorney General Percy Utah argued that the defendants had planned violent revolution, that they had collaborated with foreign communists, that they intended to bring down the government through armed invasion. The evidence, he claimed, was overwhelming. Conviction seemed certain. The only question was whether Justice Quartus de Wet would impose the ultimate penalty. The defense team was led by Bram Fischer, an Afrikaner advocate and secret member of the Communist Party who risked everything to defend principles he believed transcended loyalty to his own people. Vernon Beranger, George Bizos, Arthur Chaskelson and Joel Joffe rounded out the team. They knew they faced an uphill battle. The evidence was damning. But they could at least use the trial to tell the truth about apartheid, to explain why decent people had been driven to take up arms, to make a case not just for their clients, but for justice itself. And they had a secret weapon, Mandela's own words. He had been working on a statement from the dock, a speech that would explain and justify everything. Nadine Gordimer, the novelist, and Anthony Sampson, a journalist, helped polish the draft. Fidel Castro's famous defense speech, "History will absolve me," served as inspiration. Mandela's lawyers begged him to remove the final line, fearing it would provoke the judge into imposing death. But Mandela refused. If he was going to die, he would die speaking the trial truth. 1964. The court reconvened after a recess. The prosecution had rested its case. Now the defense would begin. But rather than call witnesses first, Bram Fischer announced that the accused number 1, Nelson Mandela, would make a statement from the dock. Utah objected, but Justice de Wet overruled him. South African law allowed defendants to speak unsworn from the dock, immune from cross-examination. Mandela rose. He was 45 years old. He had spent almost 2 years in prison. He might soon be sentenced to hang. He looked out at the packed courtroom, at his wife Winnie sitting in the gallery, at the faces of friends and enemies alike. And then, in a clear, strong voice, he began to speak. For nearly 4 hours he held that courtroom transfixed. "I am the first accused," he began. "I hold a bachelor's degree in arts and practiced as an attorney in Johannesburg for a number of years in partnership with Oliver Tambo. I am a convicted prisoner, serving 5 years for leaving the country without a permit and for inciting people to go on strike at the end of May 1961. I admit immediately that I was one of the persons who helped to form Umkhonto weSizwe, and that I played a prominent role in its affairs until I was arrested in August 1962. No evasion, no hiding. He owned everything. And then he explained why. He spoke about growing up under white domination, about how African people were denied basic human rights, about the pass laws that treated black adults like criminals simply for existing. He spoke about poverty and landlessness, about families torn apart by migrant labor, about the humiliation of racial classification, about a legal system that presumed white superiority and black inferiority. He detailed the history of the ANC's resistance, how for 50 years they had tried every peaceful means to achieve change. Deputations, petitions, negotiations, strikes, boycotts, defiance campaigns, all met with increasing repression. He described the formation of MK, explaining carefully that sabotage had been chosen precisely to avoid loss of life while still making a political impact. He refuted the prosecution's claim that the ANC was controlled by communists, explaining the alliance between the ANC and the Communist Party as a practical cooperation between groups that shared a common enemy, not ideological submission. He addressed Operation Mayibuye, acknowledging it was being discussed, but noting that no final decision had been made to implement it. And then, in the speech's most powerful section, he spoke about what kind of South Africa he envisioned. "During my lifetime, I have dedicated myself to this struggle of the African people. I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But, if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. For a long moment after Mandela sat down, no one moved. No one spoke. Justice De Wet looked down at his bench. Even Utah seemed shaken. The defense called witnesses over the following weeks, building their case. But everyone knew that Mandela's speech was the heart of their argument. It had been broadcast on radio despite official censorship. Newspapers around the world printed excerpts. Demonstrations calling for the release of the accused took place in London, New York, Lagos, Delhi. The UN called for clemency. Mandela's words had done what they were meant to do, turned the accused into accusers and the courtroom into a tribunal on apartheid itself. On June 11th, 1964, after the defense had finished its arguments and the prosecution had made its final submissions, Justice De Wet prepared to deliver his verdict. The courtroom filled to capacity. Winnie Mandela sat in the gallery, dignified in her suffering. Outside, police with dogs and guns stood ready for trouble. De Wet began speaking, his voice dry and legalistic. He found Mandela, Sisulu, Mbeki, Mhlaba, Mlangeni, Goldberg, Motsoaledi, and Kathrada guilty on all or most counts. Only Rusty Bernstein was acquitted. Then came the sentence hearing. The defense brought witnesses to testify in mitigation, arguing that however misguided the defendant's actions might have been, they were motivated by a desire for justice, not violence for its own sake. Harold Hansen, appearing for the defense, compared the ANC's struggle to the Afrikaners' own fight for freedom against British domination. On June 12, 1964, Justice De Wet pronounced sentence, life imprisonment. The courtroom erupted. Supporters sang, "Nkosi Sikelele Africa," God bless Africa. Police moved in to restore order. The condemned men were led away, but they walked with their heads high. They had expected death. Life, Even life in prison was a reprieve. As Mandela would later reflect, we had been on death row, but now we would have time to think, to plan, to continue the struggle.
The Island of Despair.
Wastes. The ferry that carried the 8 convicted men from Cape Town Harbour to Robben Island on June 13, 1964, cut through choppy grey waters under an overcast sky. The island lay 6.9 kilometres offshore, a flat wedge of rock and sand barely visible above the waves. For centuries it had served as a place of exile and punishment. The Dutch colonizers had used it for lepers and the insane. The British had used it to imprison Xhosa chiefs who resisted conquest. Now the apartheid government would use it to break the leaders of the liberation movement. As the ferry approached the island's small harbour, Mandela and his companions could see the prison buildings waiting for them like a promise of suffering. A warder greeted them with words calculated to crush hope. "This is the island. This is where you will die." Wolfgang, they were processed with deliberate humiliation. Stripped naked, given coarse prison uniforms, shorts and sandals regardless of the cold, because in the twisted logic of apartheid, African prisoners were considered less capable of bearing clothes than their coloured or Indian counterparts. Mandela became prisoner number 466-64, a number that would define him for the next 18 years. His cell in Section B measured 2 meters by 2.5 meters. A thin straw mat on the cold concrete floor served as a bed. A bucket for a toilet. A small window set high in the wall, letting in a shaft of pale light. This would be home. The door clanged shut with a finality that echoed in the silence. Through the thick walls came the sound of the sea, endless and indifferent. The routine established itself quickly, designed to break men's spirits through monotonous brutality. Woken before dawn. Cold water from a single tap for washing. Breakfast of maize porridge, thin and tasteless. Then out to the limestone quarry where the real torture began. The prisoners spent 8 hours a day chipping at the white rock with picks and shovels, their eyes unprotected from the sun's glare reflecting off the limestone. The dust got into everything, lungs and eyes and skin. Over years, many prisoners, including Mandela, suffered permanent damage to their sight from the combination of brilliant reflected light and alkaline dust. The guards watched with shamboks, leather whips ready to fall on backs that moved too slowly or voices that spoke too much. Talking was forbidden. Singing was forbidden. Any expression of humanity was forbidden. The food system reflected apartheid's hierarchies even in prison. African prisoners received the least and worst provisions. 1 teaspoon of sugar per day, while coloured and Indian prisoners received 2. Thinner porridge, fewer vegetables. The political prisoners, however, fought back with the only weapons they had, intelligence and organisation. Mandela, Sisulu, Kathrada and the others formed a committee structure to coordinate their resistance. They would document every abuse, file formal complaints through proper channels, and demand their rights under prison regulations. When they were told that African prisoners did not deserve long pants in winter, they fought that regulation for years until it changed. When their sugar ration was reduced below even the poultry allowance, they protested until it was restored. These were tiny victories, but victories nonetheless. The warders learned that these were not ordinary prisoners who would simply obey and suffer. But the isolation cut deeper than any physical hardship. Mandela was allowed 1 visit every 6 months, 30 minutes long, with a glass wall separating him from his visitor. Once every 6 months, he could write or receive a single letter, heavily censored, with words blacked out if authorities deemed them inappropriate. When his mother died in 1968, he was not permitted to attend her funeral. When his eldest son Tembi died in a car accident in 1969, again, he was denied permission to bury his own child. He sat in his cell and grieved alone, the pain beyond what any human should have to bear, the helplessness absolute. In letters to Winnie, he wrote about these losses with a restraint that made them all the more heartbreaking. He could not hold his daughters, Zeni and Zinzizwa, could not see them grow, could not comfort them when they cried for their father. They were allowed to visit only when they turned 16. For years, Winnie could not even touch her husband's hand. They spoke through phones while guards listened. Any expression of political sentiment was cut off mid-sentence. Yet somehow, impossibly, the prison became something else beyond its intended purpose. The prisoners turned it into a university, a place of learning and debate and growth. Mandela studied Afrikaans, the language of the oppressors, because he believed you needed to know your enemy's language to defeat him. He read history and philosophy, Shakespeare and Tolstoy, African writers and European theorists. Discussion groups formed around whatever texts they could obtain. Kathrada taught political economy. Sisulu taught about ANC history. Younger prisoners arrived with fire in their hearts and rage in their voices, and the older men taught them discipline and strategy, the long view of struggle. Mandela's legal training made him invaluable, and he helped many prisoners prepare their cases or file complaints. The warders tried to stop all of this, but the prisoners were too clever. They smuggled notes. They communicated through coded language. They found ways to maintain solidarity despite every effort to isolate them. And some, over time, came to respect the political prisoners, to see them as men rather than criminals. Mandela made it a practice to engage guards in conversation, to treat them as human beings, to find common ground where possible. This strategy served multiple purposes. It made daily life slightly more bearable. It sometimes yielded small favors, an extra few minutes to finish a letter, a blind eye turned to a contraband newspaper. But more importantly, it demonstrated what Mandela deeply believed, that no one was beyond reaching, that even people trained to hate could learn to see the humanity in those they had been taught to despise. Years later, some of these guards would attend Mandela's inauguration as president, invited by the man they had once guarded. The prison authorities tried periodically to create a sense of tension between us in order to break down resistance. Prison authorities tried periodically to break Mandela specifically. He was the symbol, the most famous prisoner in the world. If they could break him, the movement would suffer a devastating blow. They put him in solitary confinement for infractions real or invented. They denied him privileges. They censored his letters to the point of meaninglessness. A warder once offered to help him escape, and Mandela refused, suspecting correctly that it was a setup to kill him in a supposed escape attempt. But these tactics failed. Mandela's resolve, if anything, hardened. He exercised every day, running in place in his cell, doing calisthenics. He maintained a strict schedule of reading and study. He wrote constantly, working on his autobiography in secret, hiding the pages and smuggling them out. When warders confiscated years of his writing, he simply started again. He would not be broken. He would not surrender. News from the outside world filtered in despite all attempts at censorship. The struggle continued on the mainland. Students in Soweto rose up in 1976, and hundreds were killed by police, including 13-year-old Hector Peterson, whose death photograph galvanized international opinion. The Black Consciousness movement, led by Steve Biko, brought a new energy to resistance. When Biko was murdered in police custody in 1977, his death reminded everyone that the struggle was far from over, that people were still dying for the cause. And all the while, Mandela's own legend grew. The imprisoned leader became the face of South African resistance. People across the world wore Free Mandela t-shirts, musicians performed at solidarity concerts. The UN called for his release. The apartheid government, thinking it had silenced him by putting him on a tiny island, had instead turned him into a global symbol, more powerful than any speech he could have given. As the 1970s gave way to the 1980s, conditions on the island improved incrementally. The younger, more radical prisoners challenged the old guard, demanding rights with less patience than Mandela's generation had shown. The prison authorities, weary of constant battles and aware of international scrutiny, made concessions. Manual labor in the quarry ended in 1977. Prisoners were allowed to study for formal degrees through correspondence. More books were permitted. The food improved slightly. The visits became a bit longer, though still maddeningly restricted. Mandela was promoted to the highest prisoner classification, which brought small privileges. But he was still a prisoner. Still. Separated from his family. Still marking time in a cell while the world outside raged and changed. 18 years on Robben Island. Every day another exercise in endurance, another test of will. And through it all, the question that must have haunted his quietest moments: how much longer could he survive this? The shift. Fundament. In March 1982, without warning or explanation, authorities transferred Mandela, along with Walter Sisulu, Raymond Mhlaba, and Andrew Mlangeni, to Pollsmoor Prison in Cape Town. After 18 years on Robben Island, the move was disorienting. Pollsmoor was a maximum security prison on the mainland, and while conditions were marginally better, the isolation from their comrades on the island was severe. They were housed together in a large cell on the 3rd floor, with more space than they had ever had on the island, actual beds instead of mats on the floor, and windows that looked out over mountains in the distance. But why the move? The prison authorities offered no explanation, but over time it became clear that something was shifting in the larger political landscape. The 1980s brought a crisis beginning at in apartheid. Internally, resistance had become impossible to suppress. Township after township erupted in rebellion. Students boycotted schools, workers went on strike. The United Democratic Front, formed in 1983, coordinated mass opposition that the government could not contain. People were dying in the streets, shot by police or necklaced by angry mobs who saw them as collaborators. The distinction between combatants and civilians had blurred. South Africa was sliding towards civil war. Externally, the country was becoming an international pariah. Economic sanctions bit deeper. Foreign investment fled. Banks refused to roll over loans. Cultural and sports boycotts meant isolation from the world community. Even South Africa's traditional allies, the United States and Britain, were under pressure to act. The cost of maintaining apartheid was becoming unsustainable. In 1985, President P.W. Botha, known as the Great Crocodile for his intransigence, made an unexpected offer. He would release Mandela if Mandela would publicly reject violence as a political strategy. The offer was transmitted through Botha's Minister of Justice, and it came with conditions designed to humiliate the ANC. Mandela's response was swift and unequivocal. On February 10, 1985, his daughter Zinzi read his statement to a crowd of thousands in Soweto. "I am surprised at the conditions that the government wants to impose on me. I am not a violent man. It was only then, when all other forms of resistance were no longer open to us, that we turned to armed struggle. Let Botha show that he is different to Milan, Strydom, and Verwoerd. Let him renounce violence. Let him say that he will dismantle apartheid. Let him unban the People's Organization, the African National Congress. Let him free all who have been imprisoned, banished, or exiled for their opposition to apartheid. Let him guarantee free political activity so that people may decide who will govern them. I cherish my own freedom dearly, but I care even more for your freedom. Only free men can negotiate. Prisoners cannot enter into contracts." The crowd roared its approval. Mandela had rejected the offer, but in doing so, he had demonstrated that he, not Botha, held the moral authority. Strange things began happening after that. Mandela was moved to a separate cell, given more space and privacy than any other political prisoner. A government minister named Kobe Coetzee visited him, initiating conversations about the future of South Africa. These were not negotiations, Coetzee insisted. They were talks about talks, exploratory discussions to see if negotiation might be possible. Mandela knew he was taking a risk. Some in the ANC would see any contact with the government as betrayal. But he also knew that the armed struggle, for all its symbolic importance, was not winning the war. Neither side could achieve total victory. If there was to be a future for South Africa that did not involve a bloodbath, someone had to start talking. In 1988, after Mandela was hospitalized with tuberculosis, he was moved again, this time to Victor Verster prison near Paarl. Instead of a cell, he was given a warder's cottage, 3 rooms with a kitchen, a living room, and a bedroom. A personal cook prepared his meals. He had a television. He could receive visitors with less restriction. The prison even had a swimming pool he could use. To outsiders, it might have seemed like luxury. But Mandela understood what it really was: preparation. The government was getting him ready for release, acclimating him to a more normal life, setting the stage for his return to society. On Christmas Eve 1986, something remarkable happened. A prison commander named Brigadier Munro asked Mandela, almost casually, "Mandela, would you like to see the city?" Mandela thought it was a joke, but Munro was serious. They drove through Cape Town, Mandela in civilian clothes, no handcuffs, no chains. They bought Coca-Colas from a shop. They drove along the coast. For a few hours, Mandela tasted freedom, and the experience was bittersweet. He saw how much the world had changed in his absence. He saw white South Africans going about their lives, comfortable in their privilege, while townships burned. He saw the beauty of the city and felt the ache of separation from it. When they returned to prison, Munro said nothing more about the excursion. It had been a gift, a glimpse of what might be coming, a reminder that even prison commanders were capable of kindness. The secret meetings continued. A team of government negotiators met regularly with Mandela, and the discussions ranged over every aspect of South Africa's future. Mandela insisted on certain principles. The ANC must be unbanned. Political prisoners must be released. Exiles must be allowed to return. The state of emergency must be lifted. Only then could real negotiations begin. The government representatives probed to see if Mandela would accept anything less than one person, one vote. He would not. They floated ideas about group rights that would allow whites to maintain some separate power. Mandela rejected them as apartheid by another name. These meetings were delicate. Mandela was careful to keep ANC leadership informed through secret communications, but he was also acting on his own authority to some degree, hoping that when the time came, his comrades would understand and support what he had done. In 1989, P.W. Botha suffered a stroke and was forced to step down. His replacement, F.W. de Klerk, was a career National Party politician who had defended apartheid his entire life. No one expected much from him, but de Klerk had come to a realization that few white South Africans were ready to accept apartheid could not survive. The cost was too high, the international isolation too complete, the internal resistance too strong. The Soviet Union, which had supported the ANC, was collapsing, and the Cold War excuse that the ANC was a communist front was losing credibility. Something had to change. In December 1989, de Klerk met with Mandela for the first time. They talked for 3 hours. Mandela later said that he left the meeting believing that de Klerk was a man you could do business with. Not because de Klerk had suddenly become a moral beacon, but because he was a pragmatist who understood that change was inevitable and might be guided rather than imposed through violence. On February 2, 1990, de Klerk addressed the opening session of Parliament. What he announced shocked the nation and the world. The ANC, PAC, and South African Communist Party would be unbanned. Political prisoners would be released. The state of emergency would be lifted, and Nelson Mandela would be freed. The speech lasted less than an hour, but it ended an era. 8 days later, on February 10th, de Klerk held a press conference to announce that Mandela would walk free the next day. February 11th. After 27 years, 4 months, and 5 days in prison, the news exploded across the world. In South Africa, people danced in the streets. In London and New York, supporters who had campaigned for his release for decades wept with joy. And on Robben Island, in Pollsmoor, in prisons across South Africa, political prisoners prepared to go home, walking free. The morning of February 11th, 1990, broke clear and bright over Cape Town. At Victor Verster prison, Nelson Mandela prepared himself for the moment he had imagined for nearly 3 decades. He dressed in a grey suit, conservative and dignified. Winnie arrived, and they held each other, the years of separation a palpable presence between them. The plan was for him to walk out of the prison gates at 3 in the afternoon, but bureaucratic delays meant the world had to wait. Television crews from dozens of countries had set up outside. Thousands of people had gathered, though police kept them at a distance. The anticipation built like electricity in the air. This was not just a man being released from prison. This was history pivoting on its axis. The gates opened. Nelson Mandela walked out, Winnie at his side, his right fist raised in the traditional ANC salute. The crowd roared. Cameras flashed. Journalists shouted questions. Mandela smiled, a gentle smile that seemed almost incongruous given everything he had endured, and raised his fist higher. For the first time in 27 years, he was a free man. The drive to Cape Town took longer than expected because of the crowds. People lined the streets, cheering and weeping. When they finally arrived at the Grand Parade, a public square in front of City Hall, the scene was overwhelming. Over 50,000 people had packed into the space, waiting for hours to catch a glimpse of Mandela. As he appeared on the balcony, the noise was deafening. He tried to speak, but the public address system failed. He had to wait while technicians fixed it, and the crowd chanted and sang. When Mandela finally spoke, his words were not conciliatory. He thanked supporters, acknowledged the sacrifices of those who had died in the struggle, and made clear that the fight was far from over. Friends, comrades, and fellow South Africans, I greet you all in the name of peace, democracy, and freedom for all. I stand here before you not as a prophet, but as a humble servant of you, the people. Your tireless and heroic sacrifices have made it possible for me to be here today. I therefore place the remaining years of my life in your hands. He called for continued pressure on the government, for maintaining the armed struggle until apartheid was truly dismantled, for unity among all who opposed the regime. Some had hoped for a message of forgiveness and reconciliation. That would come, but not yet. First, there was work to do. The transition from prisoner to negotiator happened with dizzying speed. Just 3 days after his release, Mandela met with de Klerk again, and the two began the intricate dance of negotiation that would define the next 4 years. On May 2, 1990, the first formal talks between the ANC and the government took place at Groote Schuur, de Klerk's official residence in Cape Town. The Groote Schuur Minute, as the agreement became known, committed both sides to working toward peaceful resolution of the conflict. The ANC agreed to suspend the armed struggle. The government agreed to release political prisoners and allow exiles to return. It was a beginning, fragile and uncertain, but a beginning nonetheless. But the violence did not stop. In fact, it escalated. A third force, widely believed to be elements within the security services and police, fomented clashes between ANC supporters and members of the Inkatha Freedom Party, led by Mangosuthu Buthelezi. Thousands died in the early 1990s, shot or hacked or burned alive in township violence that threatened to derail negotiations entirely. Mandela accused de Klerk of complicity, of allowing his security forces to destabilize the transition to maintain white leverage. De Klerk insisted he knew nothing about it, but evidence suggested otherwise. The relationship between the two men, never warm, became strained to the breaking point. They were locked in a strange partnership, needing each other to succeed, but unable to fully trust each other. Were complex and often deadlocked. The Convention for a Democratic South Africa, known as CODESA, brought together representatives of 19 political parties and organizations. The National Party wanted to protect white interests through power-sharing arrangements that would prevent simple majority rule. The ANC insisted on one person, one vote, non-negotiable. Smaller parties jockeyed for position, trying to ensure they would not be marginalized in the new South Africa. The talks collapsed in mid-1992 after the Boipatong massacre, when 45 people were killed in an attack that many blamed on police collusion with Inkatha. Mass action and strikes followed. Civil war seemed imminent. But both Mandela and de Klerk understood that failure meant catastrophe. They pulled back from the brink, resumed talks, and slowly, painfully, hammered out compromises. In April 1993, another crisis threatened to destroy everything. Chris Hani, the popular leader of the South African Communist Party and chief of staff of Umkhonto we Sizwe, was assassinated outside his home by a white right-wing extremist. Hani was beloved by militant youth, and his death could easily have triggered an explosion of violence. President de Klerk appeared on television to condemn the killing, but his words had little effect. It was Mandela who calmed the nation. In a television address, he spoke directly to all South Africans, black and white. Tonight, I am reaching out to every single South African, black and white, from the very depths of my being. A white man, full of prejudice and hate, came to our country and committed a deed so foul that our whole nation now teeters on the brink of disaster. A white woman, of Afrikaner origin, risked her life so that we may know and bring to justice this assassin. The cold-blooded murder of Chris Hani has sent shockwaves throughout the country and the world. Now is the time for all South Africans to stand together against those who, from any quarter, wish to destroy what Chris Hani gave his life for, the freedom of all of us. The speech worked. Violence broke out in some areas, but the feared general uprising did not materialize. Mandela's moral authority had proven stronger than de Klerk's political power. Mandela and de Klerk traveled to Oslo to receive the Nobel Peace Prize jointly. It was an awkward pairing. The two men had brought South Africa back from the edge of civil war, but they did not like each other. Mandela's acceptance speech was gracious toward de Klerk, acknowledging his role in ending apartheid. De Klerk's speech emphasized the suffering of his own people, the Afrikaners, and their right to maintain their identity. But the prize recognized a larger truth. They had shown that even the bitterest enemies could find a way to negotiate rather than annihilate each other. When they returned to South Africa, the final preparations for the first democratic elections were underway. April 27, 1994, was set as the date, and despite attempts by white right-wing extremists and Inkatha to disrupt the process, the date held. The Rainbow Nation born. For 3 days, from April 26 to April 29, 1994, South Africa held its first democratic elections. Lines of voters snaked for kilometers, patient and determined. Many were voting for the first time in their lives, grey-haired grandmothers and grandfathers who had waited 70, 80 years for this moment. The ballot papers confused some who had never seen such a thing. Illiterate voters had the ANC symbol explained to them, a spear and shield. Patience and good humor prevailed. The occasional administrative chaos, the shortage of ballot papers in some areas, the long waits in hot sun, none of it dampened the joy. People sang while they waited. They danced when they finally cast their votes. Cameras captured images that would define the new South Africa. Elderly black women in traditional dress, white farmers, mixed-race youth, Indian shopkeepers, all standing in the same lines, all equal for the first time. The results surprised no one. The African National Congress won 62.65% of the vote, just short of the two-thirds majority that would have allowed them to write the constitution alone. The National Party, de Klerk's party, won 20% and would be part of the government of national unity as second-largest party. Inkatha won in KwaZulu-Natal. Smaller parties carved out their niches. On May 9th, the new National Assembly convened and elected Nelson Mandela as President of South Africa. The following day, May 10th, 1994, the inauguration took place at the Union Buildings in Pretoria, the seat of white power for 80 years. Dignitaries from around the world attended. Prince Philip represented Britain. Hillary Clinton represented the United States. Yasser Arafat came. Fidel Castro came. Leaders from across Africa filled the seats. South African jets flew overhead in formation. Military bands played. And Nelson Mandela, prisoner number 466/64, took the oath of office. Today, all of us do, by our presence here and by our celebrations in other parts of our country and the world, confer glory and hope to newborn liberty. Out of the experience of an extraordinary human disaster that lasted too long, must be born a society of which all humanity will be proud. We, who were outlaws not so long ago, have today been given the rare privilege to be host to the nations of the world on our own soil. We thank all our distinguished international guests for having come to take possession with the people of our country of what is, after all, a common victory for justice, for peace, for human dignity. His voice carried across the gathered thousands. He spoke of healing, of building a society that worked for all its people, regardless of race. Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another and suffer the indignity of being the skunk of the world. Let freedom reign. The sun shall never set on so glorious a human achievement. God bless Africa. The government of national unity that Mandela led included F.W. de Klerk as second deputy president and Thabo Mbeki as first deputy president. Cabinet positions went to members of the ANC, National Party, and Inkatha. It was an awkward coalition, but Mandela made it work through sheer force of personality and moral authority. De Klerk found himself in the strange position of taking orders from the man he had kept in prison. For his part, Mandela treated de Klerk with correctness, if not warmth. The new South Africa needed the skills and cooperation of white South Africans, needed to prevent them from feeling so threatened that they would sabotage the transition. Mandela bent over backward to reassure whites that they had a place in the Rainbow Nation, as Archbishop Desmond Tutu had dubbed it. One of Mandela's most 46 that they comes a white scroop and solution that be a lot of chargement. One of the most exactly that comes in this, for Mandela's most symbolic gestures came in 1995, when South Africa hosted the Rugby World Cup. Rugby had always been the sport of white Afrikaners, the Springboks a symbol of apartheid-era nationalism. Many in the ANC wanted to abolish the team, or at least change its name and colours. But Mandela understood that symbols matter. He visited the Springbok team during their training, learned the players' names, encouraged them. On the day of the final, played at Ellis Park Stadium in Johannesburg against New Zealand's formidable All Blacks, Mandela walked onto the field wearing a Springbok jersey with the number 6, the number of the team captain Francois Pienaar. The largely white crowd erupted in chants of "Nelson! Nelson!" It was a moment of pure magic, and when South Africa won the match in a stunning upset, Mandela presented the trophy to Pienaar. Pienaar later said he was not receiving the trophy for 60,000 fans in the stadium, but for 43 million South Africans. Mandela had turned the symbol of white supremacy into a symbol of national unity. But reconciliation, genuine reconciliation, required more than gestures. It required confronting the past honestly and fully. In 1995, Mandela signed the legislation creating the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, to be chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. The TRC had a mandate to investigate human rights violations committed by all sides during the apartheid years, from 1960 to 1994. Victims could tell their stories publicly, many for the first time. Perpetrators could apply for amnesty if they fully disclosed their crimes and could prove they were politically motivated. It was not a perfect justice. Many victims felt betrayed by amnesty for killers, but Mandela believed it was the only way forward. South Africa could not afford the endless cycle of prosecution and counter-prosecution that would tear the country apart. The TRC provided a space for truth, even if full justice remained elusive. Over several years, the Commission heard thousands of testimonies, exposing the machinery of apartheid's violence in gruesome detail. The hearings were televised. The nation watched, and slowly, painfully, a shared understanding of what had happened began to emerge. Mandela's presidency focused on transformation and development. The Reconstruction and Development Program pumped resources into housing, healthcare, and education in previously neglected black communities. Millions of people gained access to clean water and electricity for the first time. Hundreds of thousands of homes were built. The education system was integrated and reformed, though challenges of quality and access remained enormous. A new constitution was adopted in 1996, one of the most progressive in the world, guaranteeing rights to housing, healthcare, education, and protection against discrimination based on race, gender, or sexual orientation. Mandela took special pride in the Constitution's protection of gay and lesbian rights, a stance that put South Africa ahead of most countries. The economy remained a challenge. The ANC had promised socialism during the struggle, but in power, they maintained largely capitalist policies, hoping that growth would eventually lift all boats. Not everyone was happy with this compromise, but Mandela believed it was necessary to prevent capital flight and economic collapse. His personal life during these years was complicated. His marriage to Winnie, already strained by the long separation of his imprisonment, collapsed under the weight of her involvement in violent activities during his imprisonment and her refusal to show contrition before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They divorced in 1996. It was painful and public. But Mandela found love again with Graça Machel, the widow of Mozambique's former president, Samora Machel. She was a strong woman in her own right, an advocate for children's rights and education. They married on Mandela's 80th birthday in 1998, and she brought him a measure of peace and happiness that had eluded him for so much of his life. At state functions, she stood beside him with quiet dignity, and those who knew him said he seemed lighter, younger in her presence. As 1999 approached and the end of his term neared, many urged Mandela to run for a second term. The ANC would certainly have supported him. He could have served another 5 years. But he had decided from the beginning that he would serve only one term. South Africa needed to establish that presidents could step down voluntarily, that power could transfer peacefully. He groomed Thabo Mbeki as his successor, though their relationship was complex and sometimes strained. When the elections were held in 1999, the ANC won an even larger majority than in 1994, and Mbeki became president. On June 16, 1999, Nelson Mandela handed over power and retired from active politics. He was 80 years old. He had led his country through its most dangerous transition, and now he was going home to Kunu. The elder speaks. Helvetica did not mean silence. Mandela threw himself into philanthropy and global advocacy with the same intensity he had brought to politics. The Nelson Mandela Foundation, established in 1999, became his vehicle for continuing the struggle by other means. Education remained his passion. Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world, he had said, and he believed it absolutely. The foundation funded scholarships and schools, particularly in rural areas where children still studied in buildings without windows or desks. He established the Nelson Mandela Institute for Rural Development and Education specifically to train teachers for the countryside, believing that urban children would always have better access to resources, but rural children deserved the same quality of education. The HIV/AIDS crisis consumed much of his attention. South Africa had one of the highest infection rates in the world, and President Mbeki's administration was slow to acknowledge the problem and resistant to providing antiretroviral treatment. Mandela broke with his successor publicly on this issue, using his moral authority to speak truth when government was failing. In 2005, he did something remarkable. He announced that his son, Makgatho, had died of AIDS. In a country where stigma still surrounded the disease, where many died in silence with their families claiming other causes, Mandela's willingness to speak the truth helped break down barriers of shame. He launched the 46664 campaign, named after his prison number, organizing concerts that raised millions for AIDS treatment and research. Musicians from around the world participated. Peter Gabriel, Bono, Beyoncé, Annie Lennox all lent their voices to the cause. The campaign broadcast to hundreds of millions of viewers worldwide, bringing attention and resources to the pandemic that was devastating sub-Saharan Africa. Mandela also used his voice on the international stage, speaking out on issues of war and peace, poverty and inequality. When the United States prepared to invade Iraq in 2003, Mandela was one of the most prominent critics. He questioned the evidence for weapons of mass destruction, warned about the consequences of unilateral action, and criticized President George W. Bush for undermining the United Nations. His opposition carried weight precisely because he was not anti-American. He was a man who believed in multilateralism and the rule of law, who had seen what happened when powerful countries acted without restraint. Similarly, he spoke about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, calling for justice for Palestinians while maintaining that Israel had a right to exist in security. He never shied from controversy when he believed principle was at stake. But age was catching up with him. The damage done by years of manual labor, by tuberculosis, by the damp conditions of Robben Island, all of it took its toll. He developed prostate cancer. 2001 was treated successfully, but his health remained fragile. He walked more slowly. His hearing, damaged by the noise of the quarry, required hearing aids. His eyes, scarred by years of glare off limestone, troubled him. Yet he continued to appear at public events when his health allowed. In 2007, he brought together a group called the Elders, prominent leaders like Desmond Tutu, Kofi Annan, Jimmy Carter, and Mary Robinson, to work on global problems from conflict resolution to disease prevention. They were not representing governments. They were independent voices advocating for peace and human rights. Mandela's idea was that retired leaders, freed from the constraints of power, could speak uncomfortable truths and broker solutions that politicians could not. His last major public appearance came in 2010 when South Africa hosted the FIFA World Cup. At the closing ceremony, the crowd at Soccer City Stadium rose as one when Mandela arrived, driven onto the field in a golf cart. He waved, wrapped in a warm jacket against the winter cold, and the cheers were deafening. Here was the man who had transformed their country, who had kept them from civil war, who had shown that forgiveness was not weakness, but strength. He did not speak. He did not need to. His presence was enough. When the event ended and he was driven away, many in the stadium wept, sensing that they might not see him again. The final years were difficult. Mandela split his time between Johannesburg and Kunu, but increasingly he needed medical care that only the city could provide. Repeated hospitalizations for lung infections became routine. His family surrounded him, though they squabbled publicly about access and about his care, disputes that pained those who loved him. The world watched and waited, knowing that the inevitable was approaching, but hoping it might be delayed just a little longer. When he was strong enough, Graça would take him to Kunu, to the house he had built in the village where he had herded cattle as a boy. There, surrounded by the rolling hills of the Eastern Cape, he could sit and look out at the land that had formed him. The circle slowly closing.
The immortal endment.
Early evening of December 5, 2013, Nelson Mandela drew his last breath. He was at home in Houghton, Johannesburg, surrounded by his family. His daughter Zinzi held his hand. Graça Machel sat beside him. The end came peacefully, his body finally releasing the spirit that had endured so much and accomplished more. At 23:45, President Jacob Zuma appeared on national television to make the announcement. Our beloved Nelson Mandela, the founding president of our democratic nation, has departed. He passed on peacefully in the company of his family. He is now resting. He is now at peace. Our nation has lost its greatest son. Our people have lost a father. Zuma's voice broke. Across South Africa, people wept openly. Strangers embraced in the street. Flags were lowered to half-mast. A nation went into mourning. The tributes poured in from across the world. President Barack Obama, speaking from the White House, said, "We will not likely see the likes of Nelson Mandela again. So it falls to us as best we can to forward the example that he set. To make decisions guided not by hate, but by love, not by fear, but by hope. To strive not just to make ourselves better, but to make the world around us better." The Dalai Lama said, "The best tribute we can pay to him is to do whatever we can to contribute to honoring the oneness of humanity and working for peace and reconciliation." Former President F.W. de Klerk, Mandela's old adversary and partner, said, "He was a great unifier. This emphasis on reconciliation was his biggest legacy." Messages came from every continent, from leaders and ordinary people alike, all testifying to the profound impact of one man's life. South Africa observed 10 days of national mourning. Memorial services were held in churches and mosques, temples and community centers. On December 10th, the official memorial service took place at FNB Stadium in Johannesburg, the same venue where Mandela had made his last public appearance. Despite cold rain, over 60,000 people filled the stadium. World leaders attended in numbers not seen since. Obama spoke, comparing Mandela to Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. Archbishop Tutu, frail but spirited, reminded everyone that Mandela's work was not finished. The crowd sang and danced, celebrating Mandela's life rather than dwelling on death, embracing the African tradition that death is a passage, not an end. From December 11th to 13th, Mandela's body lay in state at the Union Buildings in Pretoria, the same place where he had been inaugurated as president 19 years earlier. The line of mourners stretched for kilometers. They waited for hours, sometimes in rain, to file past the open casket and pay their respects. Over the 3 days, approximately 100,000 people viewed his body. Many brought flowers. Some sang softly. Others stood in silence, tears streaming down their faces. His grandson Mandela remained with the body for all 3 days, following Thembu tradition that requires a family member to stay with the deceased until burial. Merk. The state funeral took place on December 15th in Kunu. A large tent had been erected to accommodate the 4,500 invited guests, including 8 heads of state and dozens of foreign dignitaries. But this was also a community event. The people of Kunu and surrounding villages gathered, some on the hills overlooking the ceremony, to say goodbye to their son. The service blended traditional Xhosa rituals with Christian prayers and political tributes. Speakers reflected on Mandela's long walk from prisoner to president, from militant to mediator, from symbol of resistance to embodiment of reconciliation. The casket, draped in the South African flag, rested on a platform, while military guards stood at attention. When the public part of the ceremony concluded, television cameras were turned off at the family's request. What followed was private, as it should be. 450 people, family members and close friends, remained for the burial. A military honor guard gave a 21-gun salute. Fighter jets flew overhead in missing man formation. Then, finally, Nelson Mandela was laid to rest on the grounds of his homestead in Kunu, overlooking the hills where he had played as a boy and the grasslands where he had herded cattle. The grave faces east, toward the rising sun, toward the future he had fought so long to make possible. Pedestani left defies easy summary. He spent 27 years in prison and emerged without bitterness. He led a nation out of apartheid without a bloodbath. He demonstrated that reconciliation is not betrayal of justice, but its highest expression. He showed that moral authority can be more powerful than political power, that one person, guided by principle and prepared to sacrifice, can bend the arc of history toward justice. His life spanned nearly a century, from colonial rule through apartheid to democracy. He saw the world move from a place where racial oppression was normal to one where it was universally condemned. And he did more than witness that change. He made it happen. The world celebrates Mandela Day every July 18th, his birthday, with a call for people to give 67 minutes of their time to service, 1 minute for each year he spent in active struggle. Schools bear his name on every continent. His autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, has been translated into dozens of languages. His image appears on South African currency and postage stamps. Statues of him stand in London, New York, and countless other cities. These are the visible monuments. But the real legacy lives in the lives of millions of South Africans who grew up free because of what he sacrificed, in the example he set for peaceful transition from authoritarianism to democracy, in the inspiration he provides to activists and leaders who face seemingly insurmountable odds. He was not perfect. He made mistakes. He could be stubborn and imperious. His support for some authoritarian leaders who had backed the ANC during the struggle troubled critics. His personal life was complicated, marked by failed relationships and children who felt abandoned. He sometimes struggled to navigate the competing demands of family and mission, choosing the mission almost every time. These flaws do not diminish his accomplishments. They humanize them. Mandela never claimed to be a saint. "I am not a saint, unless you think of a saint as a sinner who keeps on trying," he once said. He was a man, flawed and finite, who dedicated his life to a cause larger than himself and saw it through to the end. The South Africa he left behind in 2013 was not the perfect rainbow nation some had hoped for. Inequality persisted. Corruption had infected government institutions. Crime remained a serious problem. The HIV/AIDS pandemic, while better managed than before, still devastated communities. Many blacks felt that economic transformation had not gone far enough, that white South Africans still controlled too much wealth. Some whites felt marginalized in the new dispensation. The dream of a fully just society remained unrealized. But democracy endured. Power transferred peacefully through multiple elections. Free speech flourished. The Constitution's protections held. And these things, in a continent where so many liberation movements devolved into tyranny, were no small achievements. Death, South Africans reflected on what they had gained and what remained to be done. A new generation that had not lived under apartheid struggled to understand what the old people's sacrifices had meant. Some took freedom for granted. Others felt the weight of unfinished business. But all knew the name Nelson Mandela. All had heard the stories, and in a fractured world increasingly divided by race and ideology, religion and nationality, the example of Mandela's life remained a beacon. It said that enemies could become partners, that the oppressed could liberate themselves without becoming oppressors, that forgiveness was possible without forgetting, that one person, standing firm for what is right, could change the course of history. The sun sets over Kunu, casting long shadows across the hills where cattle graze and children play. In the graveyard where Nelson Mandela rests, fresh flowers appear regularly, left by visitors from near and far who come to pay their respects. The wind carries the sound of singing from the village below. The land endures, as it always has, patient and eternal. And somewhere in the dust and grass and stone, a spirit rests, its work done, its legacy unfolding in ways impossible to predict, but profound beyond measure. The long walk to freedom continues, and those who walk it, whether they know it or not, walk in the footsteps of a man who proved that it is possible to make the journey and arrive, not perfect, but
Transformed.